This was the moment when every equation said they should be dead. 36 men with guns that could not move once they fired, facing 200 tanks they could not see. The fog was so thick a man could vanish at arm's length. The mathematics were simple and merciless. Fire once and the muzzle flash tells the enemy exactly where you are. Stay silent and the Panzers roll past into France. There was no good choice. There was only the next 30 seconds, and the 30 seconds after that, and the knowledge that most of them would not see tomorrow. What happened in that fog changed the course of the war in ways the men pulling triggers would never know. This is the story of how impossible odds were held by men who had every reason to run, and every reason to believe that their deaths would mean nothing at all. The fog came in sometime after midnight on the 7th of August, 1944. It rolled across the Norman hedgerows like something alive, something deliberate, as if the landscape itself had decided to obscure what was about to happen. Sergeant Robert Callahan stood in a field east of Mortain and watched the world disappear. First the tree line went, swallowed into gray nothing. Then the farmhouse 200 yards to his left. Then the road. Then his own hands when he held them out in front of his face. 15 feet, maybe less. That was the world now. That was the entire battlefield. He commanded a gun crew in Company A of the 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion. The designation sounded impressive until you understood what it actually meant. They had towed 3-inch M5 anti-tank guns. Towed. Pulled behind trucks until you found a good position, then unhitched and dug in and hoped to God the enemy came from the direction you were facing. Once you fired, you had perhaps 90 seconds to limber the gun back onto the truck and displace before every German gun in range zeroed in on your muzzle flash. That was the doctrine. That was what they had trained for back in England, back when the war still felt like something you could prepare for with enough drill and repetition. But doctrine assumed you could see the enemy. Doctrine assumed you had mobility. Doctrine assumed a lot of things that had nothing to do with this fog, this darkness, this field in Normandy where the only sound was his own breathing and the distant, almost subliminal rumble of engines that might have been imagination. Callahan had been a schoolteacher before the war. Mathematics. He had taught algebra to 16-year-olds in Pennsylvania who could not imagine why they would ever need to calculate the trajectory of a thrown ball or the intersection of two lines. He had tried to make it relevant, tried to show them that math was just the language of the real world, but most of them had stared out the window and waited for the bell. Now he stood in a field doing calculations that would determine whether men lived or died, and he wished desperately that the equations were as simple as the ones he had written on blackboards. The radio had gone silent 2 hours ago. Not dead. Deliberately silent. Orders from battalion command, relayed down through Company A, passed from gun crew to gun crew in whispers that felt too loud in the suffocating quiet. Radio silence because the Germans were coming, and command did not want them triangulating American positions from transmissions. Radio silence because what was about to happen was too big for reassuring voices and tactical updates. Radio silence because they were on their own now, and everyone knew it. Callahan's crew was 5 men. Private First Class Eddie Morrison on the breech, a kid from Alabama who never stopped talking except when he was loading shells, and then he worked with the focused silence of a surgeon. Corporal James Henriksen on the traverse and elevation, a dairy farmer from Wisconsin who could estimate range by instinct in ways that made no sense until you watched him put 3 rounds through the same hole at 1,000 yards. Private Tommy D'Angelo on the ammunition, short and stocky and strong enough to carry 2 rounds at a time when everyone else struggled with 1. Private First Class Leonard Hutchins on security, supposedly watching for infantry while the rest of them worked the gun, but mostly just chain-smoking lucky strikes and staring into the fog like he could burn it away with concentration. And then there was Callahan himself, the gun commander, the man who decided when to fire and when to stay silent, The man who would live or die based on whether he chose correctly in the half-second before a decision became irreversible. They had dug the gun in just after sunset the previous evening. A good position, or what counted as good in the impossible terrain of the Norman bocage. Slight rise, giving them a marginal advantage in visibility and fields of fire. Hedgerow to their left providing some cover, though Callahan knew that a hedgerow would stop nothing that a Panzer decided to push through. Open field to their front, perhaps 300 yards before the next line of vegetation. Dirt track to their right, leading back toward Mortain, the route they would take if they survived long enough to retreat. If. The word kept circulating through his thoughts like a marble rolling around a bowl, never quite settling. If they survived. If they could see the enemy before the enemy saw them. If the fog lifted before dawn. If the Germans came from the direction they were facing. If battalion headquarters had been right about the intelligence reports suggesting a major counteroffensive. If any of this made sense. Morrison spoke first, his voice so quiet it was almost lost in the muffling effect of the fog. "Sarge, you hear that?" Callahan had heard it. He had been hearing it for the past 10 minutes, trying to convince himself it was his imagination or distant thunder or anything other than what he knew it actually was. Engines. Not truck engines. Not the high whine of American vehicles. Something deeper, something heavier. Something that vibrated in your chest before you consciously registered the sound. "Panthers," Henriksen said. It was not a question. The Corporal had been at Kasserine Pass in North Africa, back when American tank destroyers first learned what German armor could do to them. He knew the sound of a Panther tank the way a man knows his wife's footsteps in another room. "How many?" D'Angelo asked. "Does it matter?" Hutchins muttered, lighting another cigarette despite Callahan standing order against visible light. The red glow of the match flared and died in the fog. "1 Panther or 10, we cannot exactly drive away." "Put that out," Callahan said, but there was no force behind it. Hutchins was right. The doctrine they had learned, the careful training in shoot-and-scoot tactics, all of it was predicated on mobility they did not have. Once they fired, they would have perhaps 90 seconds to limber the gun onto the truck, perhaps another minute to drive to a new position. But in this fog, driving meant driving blind, and driving blind meant driving off the road into a ditch or a tree or straight into a German infantry position. So they would stay. They would fire and then they would stay, and the Germans would know exactly where they were. The sound of engines grew louder. Not approaching quickly, but approaching inevitably, the way dawn approaches even when you do not want the night to end. Callahan tried to picture the tactical situation, tried to overlay the intelligence briefings onto the terrain he could no longer see. Operation Lüttich. That was what command had called it. The Germans called it Operation Lüttich. A counteroffensive designed to cut the American breakthrough at Avranches, to split the Allied forces and drive west to the coast. 4 Panzer divisions, they said. Roughly 200 tanks. Maybe more. Intelligence was never precise about numbers, and precision hardly mattered when you were facing odds that could not be overcome through cleverness or courage. The goal was Avranches, 30 miles west. The path was through Mortain, through the fields where Callahan and his crew sat in the dark, listening to engines that should not exist this far forward, preparing to do something that felt less like combat and more like execution. "Range cards are useless," Morrison said suddenly. He had been checking their pre-registered firing positions, the carefully prepared calculations that told them exactly where to aim for any target that appeared in specific locations across their front. But range cards assumed visibility, assumed you could see landmarks and reference points and the targets themselves. "We fire at muzzle flashes," Callahan said. It was the only option, the only tactic that made sense when you could not see 15 feet. Wait for a German tank to fire its main gun, see the flash, calculate the position, return fire, hope you hit something vital before they adjusted and killed you. "They will see our flash too," Henriksen pointed out. Yes, Callahan agreed. There was nothing else to say. Yes, they would see the flash. Yes, they would know where the shot came from. Yes, they would return fire with guns that were bigger and more accurate and mounted on platforms that could move. Yes, this was suicide dressed up as tactics. But if they did nothing, the Germans would roll through, would take Mortain, would drive west, would cut the American forces in half, would potentially change the entire outcome of the Normandy campaign. One gun crew could not stop that. One gun crew could not even slow it down, not really. But one gun crew firing and another gun crew firing, and a dozen gun crews firing from positions the Germans could not predict, in fog so thick that even overwhelming force became disoriented and cautious, might buy time, might buy hours, might buy a day, might mean something. The first muzzle flash came at 03:15 hours. Callahan did not check his watch, but he would remember the moment with the precision of trauma, the way certain instants burn themselves into memory with chemical permanence. A blossom of yellow-orange light, there and gone in a fraction of a second, perhaps 200 yards to their front and slightly right. A German tank firing at something, at nothing, at ghosts in the fog. Target, Callahan said quietly. Estimated 200 yards, right edge of the field. Henriksen was already traversing the gun, moving with the smooth mechanical efficiency of repetition become instinct. Morrison had a round in his hands before Callahan finished speaking. D'Angelo crouched ready with the next shell, and Hutchins had actually put out his cigarette and picked up his rifle, though what he thought he would do with a rifle against a Panzer was unclear. On target, Henriksen reported. Callahan's hand hovered over Henriksen's shoulder, the signal to fire. Every atom of his mathematics training screamed that this was wrong. 200 yards was a guess. The angle was a guess. They did not know if the German tank was facing them or facing away, did not know if it was moving or stationary, did not know anything except that it existed somewhere in that general direction, and that firing would reveal their position to every German soldier within a quarter mile. He thought about his students back in Pennsylvania, thought about the equations he had written on the board about probability and risk and expected outcomes, thought about how the expected outcome of this situation was death, his and his crew's, and how the probability of survival decreased with every second they stayed in this position. Thought about how none of that mattered because this was what they were here to do. Fire, he said. The 3-inch gun bucked against its trail spades with a crack that seemed to tear the fog apart. The muzzle flash lit up the entire position, turned the world from invisible gray to overexposed white for a single instant, and then plunged them back into darkness that felt even more absolute than before. Callahan's ears rang. His night vision was destroyed. He could not see anything, could not hear anything except the high whine of tinnitus and Morrison's voice shouting something that might have been reload, or might have been reloading, or might have been something else entirely. He did not know if they had hit, did not know if the round had gone high or low or wide, did not know anything except that somewhere in the fog, Germans were now very interested in where that shot had come from. Displacing, Morrison yelled, suddenly audible as Callahan's hearing started to return. No, Callahan said, grabbing the private's shoulder. We stay. Sarge, Doctrine says. Doctrine is dead. We drive blind in this fog. We will be dead 10 seconds later. We stay. We reload. We wait for another target. The crew stared at him. In the absolute darkness, he could not see their faces, but he could feel the weight of their understanding settling over the position like a shroud. They were not displacing. They were not following the careful training that was supposed to keep them alive. They were staying in place, waiting for the Germans to kill them. Unless the Germans could not find them. Unless the fog that trapped the Americans also trapped the Germans. Unless being blind and immobile was actually an advantage when your enemy was just as blind, and their mobility meant nothing. It was the worst logic Callahan had ever constructed, but it was all they had. 20 seconds after their shot, A round screamed through the space where they crouched. High, perhaps 10 feet above their heads, but close enough that Callahan felt the pressure wave and heard the shell's passage as a freight train roar that Dopplered away into the distance. The Germans were firing back, but they were guessing, shooting at where they thought an anti-tank position might be based on the muzzle flash they had seen. They had guessed wrong by 10 feet. "Stay low," Callahan said unnecessarily. His crew was already as low as they could get without climbing into the earth itself. More engine sounds now, from multiple directions. The battle was beginning in earnest, gun crews across the American defensive line opening fire at targets they could barely see, Germans returning fire at positions they could barely estimate. The fog turned the entire sector into a nightmare of acoustics and guesswork, every sound distorted and amplified and directionless. You could hear a Panther's engine and have no idea if it was 100 yards away or 1,000. You could hear infantry moving through hedgerows and not know if they were American or German or 50 feet away or on the other side of the commune. Another muzzle flash, closer this time, perhaps 150 yards, almost directly ahead. Callahan called the target and Henriksen adjusted and they fired again, and again the world turned white and then black, and again they had no idea if they hit anything, and again the Germans fired back and again they missed by margins that felt like providence, but were really just the mathematical consequence of shooting blind. Reload, wait, fire at the next flash, reload, wait, fire again. It became a rhythm, a terrible dance where the music was artillery and the partners were death and chance. Callahan lost track of time, lost track of how many rounds they had fired. D'Angelo was moving between the gun and the ammunition truck now, hauling shells forward in loads that should have required 2 men, his breath coming in ragged gasps that Callahan could hear even over the chaos of battle. And then Hutchins said, "Contact left," in a voice that had gone very flat and very calm, and Callahan understood that their luck had just run out. He turned and saw nothing at first, just fog and darkness and the vague shapes of hedgerow. Then movement. Not a tank. Worse than a tank. Infantry. Panzer grenadiers moving through the field in a line, maybe 30 yards away, maybe less, closing on their position with the steady inevitability of men who knew where they were going. "How many?" Callahan whispered. "Squad," Hutchins said. "Maybe 10 men, could be a whole platoon behind them." The gun was facing the wrong direction, was built to kill tanks, not infantry, could traverse, but not fast enough, not quietly enough. If they tried to swing the 3-inch gun around to face the infantry, the Germans would hear the movement and know exactly where they were. If they stayed silent, the Germans would walk right into their position. "Rifles," Callahan said quietly. The word felt absurd. They were about to fight a squad of German infantry with 5 rifles and whatever sidearms they were carrying. The mathematics of it were as stark as the fog. 10 Germans, all of them trained infantry, all of them armed with weapons designed for close combat. 5 Americans, all of them tank destroyer crew, all of them trained to service a gun that was now useless. But there was no other choice. There was never any other choice. Morrison was closest to the advancing line. He brought his M1 rifle up slowly, aiming at shapes that were barely darker than the fog around them. Henriksen had drawn his pistol, a Colt model 1911 that looked like a child's toy in his large farmer's hands. D'Angelo had a carbine, and Hutchins still had his rifle, and Callahan had his own sidearm, and all of them were about to die in a field they could not see fighting an enemy they could barely distinguish from shadows. The Germans were close enough now that Callahan could hear their breathing, could hear the soft clink of equipment and the rustle of wool uniforms against vegetation. They were not being particularly stealthy, because they did not know the Americans were there. Were probably just advancing through the fog looking for targets of opportunity, as confused and disoriented as everyone else on this God-forsaken battlefield. One of them spoke, German words that Callahan did not understand, but the tone was clear. A question, probably something like, "Where are we?" or "Do you see anything?" The kind of thing soldiers say when they are lost and scared and trying to maintain discipline in conditions that destroy discipline. Morrison fired first. The M1 cracked and one of the shapes fell, and then everyone was firing, the gun position turning into a strobing hell of muzzle flashes and ricochets and men screaming in English and German and the universal language of pain. Callahan emptied his pistol at nothing, at everything, at shapes that might have been men or might have been bushes or might have been his imagination. Beside him, Henriksen was firing with careful precision despite the chaos, each shot deliberate and aimed. And then something hit Henriksen in the shoulder and he spun and fell and did not get up. "Corporal down," someone shouted, "Die Angelo maybe." And Callahan was moving toward Henriksen without thinking, without calculating the risk, just moving because that was what you did when someone in your crew was hit. He grabbed the corporal's jacket and dragged him back toward the gun, felt wetness that was probably blood, heard Henriksen gasping something that might have been "leave me," or might have been something else. The firing stopped as suddenly as it started. The Germans were gone, retreating into the fog or dead or just as confused as the Americans. Callahan could not tell anything except that Henriksen was breathing, and that was something, that was more than nothing. "Hutchins, check the perimeter," Callahan ordered, his voice steadier than he felt. "Morrison, get a dressing on the corporal. Die Angelo back on ammunition. We are not done." Because they were not done. Could not be done. The sun would rise eventually, even through this fog, and when it did the Germans would see exactly where every American gun position was, and then the real killing would begin. Until then, they had darkness and fog, and the terrible equality that came from everyone being blind. They got Henriksen stabilized. The wound was bad but not immediately fatal, shoulder torn up by what looked like a rifle round, bone probably shattered, but the bleeding was manageable. The corporal was conscious and trying to get back to the gun, kept saying he could still work the elevation with one arm, until Callahan told him to shut up and stay down in a tone that allowed no argument. Morrison took over the traverse and elevation. He was not as good as Henriksen, but he was competent, and competent was all they had. Die Angelo moved up to the breach, and Hutchins stayed on security, and Callahan stayed in command of a gun crew that had already lost 20% of its strength before the sun had risen. The battle continued. Fire at a flash, reload, fire at another flash, reload. The rhythm became hypnotic, almost meditative, a mantra of violence that pushed out thought and fear and the knowledge that each shot might be the one that finally brought German fire accurate enough to kill them all. Somewhere to their left another American gun position was firing, the crack of a 3-inch audible even through the chaos. Somewhere to their right an explosion, a hit, maybe, or a gun being destroyed, no way to tell. The fog turned everything into guesswork and probability. Callahan's training said this should not work, said that static positions without mutual support or overlapping fields of fire or clear visibility were death traps that competent attackers would overwhelm through fire and maneuver. But his training had not accounted for fog this thick, had not accounted for Germans who were just as lost as the Americans, just as blind, just as reduced to firing at guesses and hoping for the best. The mathematics of conventional warfare did not apply in this fog. This was something else, something primal and ancient, closer to medieval combat than modern mechanized battle. You could not maneuver what you could not see, could not mass fires on what you could not locate, could not apply doctrine that assumed information and mobility and all the other things that made modern war modern. So it came down to who could endure, who could keep firing despite the fear and the casualties and the absolute certainty that they were losing, that every hour bought was bought with blood and lives that would never be recovered. The Germans had more tanks, more men, more of everything, but they did not have more courage than men who knew they were already dead and chose to fight anyway. Time lost meaning. Callahan had no idea if they had been fighting for 1 hour or 4. The fog did not lift. The darkness did not fade. It felt like they had always been in this field, had always been firing at ghosts, would always be here until someone finally calculated the correct angle and sent a shell through their position and ended the terrible mathematics of survival. And then slowly, almost imperceptibly, things changed. The fog did not lift, but it thinned. Not much. Not enough to see clearly, but enough that 15 feet of visibility became 20, then 25. Enough that shapes stopped being completely abstract and started having definition. Enough that when Callahan looked forward, he could see the hulking silhouette of a Panther tank perhaps 100 yards away, stopped, its gun elevated and searching for targets it could not quite identify. "Do you see it?" he asked Morrison, already knowing the answer. "I see it, Sarge." It was the first time they had actually seen a target instead of just guessing at one. The first time the mathematics became simple and clear. Range 100 yards, tank stationary, hull down behind a slight rise but turret exposed. A clean shot. A shot they could make even in this visibility. A shot that had maybe a 50-50 chance of penetrating the Panther's frontal armor at this range, and if it did not penetrate, they would have revealed their position for nothing. But 50-50 was better odds than they had been working with all night. "Fire when ready," Callahan said. Morrison adjusted, took his time. Breathed out slowly like Henriksen had taught him, like every gun crew learned, steady pressure on the traverse and careful calculation of elevation. And then the gun fired, and the round went exactly where it was aimed, and Callahan saw it hit. Saw the impact against the Panther's turret ring, saw the flash and spark that meant penetration, and a moment later saw the internal explosion as ammunition cooked off, and turned the tank into a pyre that burned yellow and orange even through the thinning fog. "Hit," someone said. Maybe D'Angelo, maybe Hutchins, maybe Morrison himself. It hardly mattered. They had killed their first confirmed tank of the morning, and the confirmation felt simultaneously triumphant and hollow, because one tank was nothing against 200. One kill was a rounding error in the larger mathematics of this battle. But it was something. It was more than nothing. The fog continued to thin as false dawn approached. Not lifting, not really, but transitioning from absolute blindness to something more like severe myopia. Callahan could see 200 yards now, maybe 250. Could see the field they had been defending, see the churned earth where German tanks had advanced and been stopped or slowed or simply confused by terrain and fog and American fire. Could see bodies, German infantry who had tried to advance on foot and been caught by American rifles or machine gun fire from positions he had not known existed. Could see the burned-out hulk of a German half-track, still smoking, crew dead or fled. Could see, most importantly, that they were not alone. Other American positions were visible now, gun crews and infantry strongpoints scattered across the sector in a loose defensive line that had somehow, impossibly, held through the night. Not held perfectly. There were gaps, places where the Germans had broken through, positions that had been overrun or abandoned. But held enough, slowed enough, made the Germans pay enough that their advance had been measured in yards instead of miles. Callahan's crew was down to 3 effective men plus 1 wounded. They had fired maybe 20 rounds, maybe more. He had lost count somewhere around the 15th shot. Had killed 1 confirmed tank and possibly damaged others. Had fought off 1 infantry probe. Had survived the night through a combination of skill and luck, and the sheer random chance that came from firing blind into fog at an enemy who was equally blind. By any rational calculation, they should be dead. The odds had said they should be dead. The doctrine had said they should be dead. But doctrine did not account for fog and chance, and the stubborn refusal of men to die when dying was the logical outcome. The sun came up just before 0600 hours, not that Callahan could see it through the overcast. But the light changed, went from black to gray to something approaching visibility, and with visibility came new problems because visibility worked both ways. The Germans could see the American positions now, could call artillery on them, could coordinate their advance instead of stumbling through the fog. The advantage of blindness was gone, And what replaced it was the cold calculus of conventional warfare, where the side with more tanks and more men generally won. Except that as the morning brightened, Callahan heard new sounds, American sounds, the whine of Sherman tank engines distinct from the deeper rumble of German armor. The radios came back to life, battalion command finally breaking silence now that the Germans knew where everyone was anyway. Orders flooded in, tactical updates, reports from other positions, and through the chaos of competing voices one thing became clear. The Germans had not broken through, had not taken Mortain, had not reached Avranches, had been stopped, or at least slowed, by forces that should not have been able to stop them. The 743rd Tank Battalion arrived just after dawn, M4 Sherman tanks moving up the roads that led east from Mortain, reinforcing the positions that had held through the night. They were under strength, outnumbered by the German armor, but they were mobile and coordinated, and they represented something that had been absent during the night. A reserve, a capability to respond, proof that the thin line of defenders had not been completely alone. And behind the Shermans came something even more valuable, artillery. American 105mm howitzers, registered on pre-planned targets, directed by forward observers who could finally see the battlefield now that the fog was lifting. The Germans tried to press their attack, tried to exploit the morning visibility, but they were advancing into a killing ground where every approach was covered by interlocking fields of fire, where every movement drew immediate artillery response, where the advantage of numbers was negated by terrain and preparation and defenders who had already proven they would not break. Callahan's position was reinforced around 0700 hours by a squad of infantry from the 30th Division, regular army soldiers, who looked at the shot-up gun position and the wounded corporal and the exhausted crew, and said very little but took up positions around the perimeter, with the quiet professionalism of men who understood exactly what had happened here. Their lieutenant, a kid who looked maybe 22, asked Callahan for a situation report, and Callahan gave him one, kept it brief and factual, left out the parts about firing blind and fighting off German infantry and thinking he was going to die approximately 50 times over the course of the night. The lieutenant nodded and said, "You held," like it was a simple statement of fact instead of something impossible. "We held," Callahan agreed. By mid-morning the German attack had stalled, not stopped. The fighting would continue for days, the Germans pressing hard to break through to Avranches, the Americans feeding in reinforcements and calling in air support, and fighting the kind of brutal attritional battle that characterized the entire Normandy campaign. But stalled, delayed, forced to pay a price in time and casualties that they could not afford. The air support arrived around 0900 hours. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, American fighter bombers that had been grounded during the night by the same fog that had blinded everyone else, but now they came in low and mean and angry, bombing and strafing German columns that were suddenly exposed on roads they had advanced down in darkness. Callahan watched them work, watched the bomb impacts and the rockets and the devastating effect of air power applied to targets that could no longer hide. The Panthers that had survived the night began withdrawing, pulling back to defensive positions, because staying exposed to American air power was suicide. The Germans would try again, would attack again over the following days, but they would never get as close to breaking through as they had in those first hours of August 7th, when fog had turned the battlefield into chaos, and small groups of Americans with obsolete guns had held against overwhelming force through nothing more than determination and the willingness to die in place. Hill 314 became famous, though Callahan did not know that at the time. The surrounded American forces on that hill, cut off by the German advance, held for days against repeated attacks and became a symbol of American stubbornness in Normandy. The tank destroyer battalions that fought in the fog, that fired blind and held their positions despite doctrine saying they should displace, became case studies in how desperation could overcome tactical disadvantage. The entire Battle of Mortain became a turning point, the moment when the German counteroffensive failed and the Allied breakout from Normandy became irreversible. But Callahan did not know any of that, not then. He only knew that the sun was up and his crew was alive and Henriksen needed medical evacuation, and they had somehow survived a night that should have killed them all. The relief was not joy, was not triumph, was just exhaustion and the numb realization that they would have to do this again tomorrow and the day after, and every day until the war ended or they died, whichever came first. The mathematics of it were simple. Every day you survived was a day you probably should not have survived. Every battle you fought through was a battle where the odds favored your death. Eventually, the numbers would catch up. Eventually, the luck would run out. Eventually, you would face a situation where blind firing and stubborn courage were not enough, and that would be the end of the calculation. But not today. Today they had held. Today the fog had been an ally instead of an enemy. Today the Germans had learned that overwhelming force meant nothing if you could not see what you were overwhelming. Callahan's crew was rotated off the line 3 days later, pulled back for rest and refit and replacement of the equipment they had lost. Henriksen was evacuated to a field hospital and eventually sent back to England for surgery and recovery. He would survive, would keep his arm though he would never have full use of it again, would go home after the war and go back to his dairy farm, and never talk much about what happened in a field outside Mortain in the early morning of August 7, 1944. Morrison would be killed 2 weeks later in a different field, a different battle, a different impossible situation where the mathematics said he should have lived, but did not. D'Angelo would survive the war and go back to New York and work construction and raise 4 kids and die in his sleep at 78, having never told his family the details of the worst night of his life. Hutchins would be wounded at the bulge, would lose his left leg below the knee, would spend the rest of his life walking with a cane and smoking Lucky Strikes, and occasionally waking up in the middle of the night convinced he could hear Panther engines in the distance. Callahan would survive, would fight through France and into Germany, would be in the first units to reach the concentration camps and see things that made the Battle of Mortain seem like a child's game in comparison. Would come home and go back to teaching, but would never be able to look at algebraic equations the same way, would never be able to separate math from the memory of calculating firing solutions in fog, so thick you could not see your own hands. Would teach for 30 more years and retire and write a memoir that he never published. Because how do you explain to people who were not there that sometimes the impossible happens, that sometimes small numbers defeat large numbers, that sometimes courage and fog and blind luck combine to create outcomes that no equation could predict? The Battle of Mortain lasted 6 days. Operation Lüttich failed. The Germans lost approximately 200 tanks and were forced to withdraw. The Allies consolidated their breakout from Normandy and began the drive toward Paris and beyond. The war in France had perhaps 4 months left before the German army in the West collapsed entirely. And all of it, every bit of the larger strategic picture, had hinged in part on men like Callahan and his crew, fighting in fog they could not see through, firing at targets they could barely identify, holding positions they could not escape, buying time measured in hours that changed the course of nations measured in years. That is the impossible part. Not that they fought well or courageously. Soldiers fight well and courageously in every war, and courage alone never decides outcomes. The impossible part is that it mattered, that their individual actions, their specific choices in those specific moments, had consequences that rippled outward in ways they could never see or understand. One gun crew in one field in one battle in one campaign in one theater of a global war, and yet their decisions changed things, shifted probabilities, altered the mathematics in ways that made Allied victory more likely and German success less possible. You cannot teach that in a classroom, cannot put it in an equation, cannot explain to 16-year-olds staring out windows why the intersection of two lines or the trajectory of a thrown object might someday be the difference between life and death, victory and defeat, a world that continues and a world that ends. Callahan tried, after the war, tried to make his math lessons relevant by explaining that probability and statistics were not abstract concepts, but tools that people used to make impossible decisions. Tried to tell his students that someday they might face situations where the equation was simple and terrible. Stay and probably die but maybe accomplish something, or run and probably live but certainly fail. Tried to explain that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to do the math and choose to stay anyway. Most of them still stared out the window, still waited for the bell, still could not imagine why any of this would ever matter to them. And Callahan could not explain that he hoped they were right, hoped they would never need to know, hoped that their generation would never face a morning where the fog was so thick you could not see your hands, and the sound of engines meant death approaching in ways you could not prevent or escape. Hoped but did not believe, because the mathematics of history suggested that every generation faced their fog eventually. Their moment when the numbers said they should fail but they tried anyway. Their calculation where courage and chance and desperation combined to create outcomes that should not have been possible. The men who fought at Mortain did not see themselves as heroes, did not see themselves as anything except survivors, and even that was temporary, conditional on luck that might run out tomorrow. They did what they did because the alternative was unacceptable, and because someone had to, and because in that moment in that fog there was no one else. And that ultimately is the story. Not that they won. They did not win, not in any clean or decisive sense. Not that they were special. They were ordinary men doing an ordinary job in extraordinary circumstances. The story is that they stayed, that when every equation said to run, they calculated the cost of running and decided it was too high, that they bought time with their lives and their blood and their willingness to die in a field they could not see for reasons they did not fully understand. And that time mattered. Those hours bought in fog and darkness and terror became days, became weeks, became the difference between German success and Allied victory in Normandy, became part of the larger cascade of decisions and battles and impossible moments that ended the war in Europe 9 months later, became one more piece of evidence that wars are not decided by resources or technology or doctrine, but by the men who choose to stay when staying means death. That is worth remembering, worth understanding, worth teaching to generations who might someday face their own fog, their own impossible odds, their own moment when the mathematics say they should fail, but they choose to try anyway. Because the alternative is to believe that it was all luck, all chance, all meaningless chaos that happened to break in favor of the Allies through random probability. And maybe that is true. Maybe Callahan and his crew were just lucky, and Morrison was just unlucky, and all of it was just statistics playing out across millions of individual moments with no larger meaning or pattern. But Callahan never believed that, could not believe that, even when the math suggested he should, could not look at what happened in that field and see only random chance, could not teach probability and statistics without remembering that sometimes the unlikely outcome is the one that happens, and sometimes that outcome changes everything, and sometimes the reason it happens is because men decide to make it happen even when every equation says they will fail. That is the lesson. That is what the fog of Mortain teaches us if we are willing to learn it. That courage matters. That individual choices matter. That the mathematics of war are not as deterministic as they appear, because they do not account for the variable that cannot be quantified. The human decision to stay and fight when flight is the rational choice. And that, more than any battle statistic or casualty figure or strategic analysis, is why this story matters. Because it is not really a story about tanks and fog and a counteroffensive that failed. It is a story about ordinary men who faced impossible odds and chose courage over calculation, who stayed when they should have run, who died or nearly died so that others could advance, who became part of a victory they would never fully understand or appreciate. They deserve to be remembered, not as heroes, which most of them would reject, not as special, which they were not, but as men who did what had to be done when the moment required it, who calculated the cost and paid it anyway, who held a line that could not be held through sheer stubborn refusal to accept that it could not be held. That is what happened in the fog of Mortain on August 7, 1944. That is the story that needs to be told. If this story moved you, if it made you think about courage or sacrifice or the impossible choices that ordinary people face in extraordinary circumstances, then share it. Let others know that these men fought and died in a field in Normandy so that we could live in a world where their sacrifice mattered. Like this video, if you believe their story deserves to be heard. Subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more stories about forgotten battles and unsung heroes and moments when the mathematics of war were overcome by human determination. And leave a comment below answering this question. If you were in Sergeant Callahan's position, standing in that fog with a gun that could not move and an enemy you could not see, knowing that firing meant almost certain death but silence meant certain failure, what would you have done? Would you have had the courage to stay, or would the equations have convinced you to run? There is no wrong answer. There is only the question and the terrible weight of knowing that men like Callahan faced it for real and chose to stay, and that their choice is why we remember their names today.